Where does your food come from? Delicious, amazing, fulfilling food? In the not so distant future, cellular agriculture will take traditional farm food and change it to be produced in a lab at scale. How will this affect what we eat? Its challenges, the rapid development, and the massive implications of cell ag on supply chain, and more are all topics we get into today with our guest, Ahmed Khan, founder and editor of CellAgri, the internet's premier cell ag news and insight reporting website. He is also one of the founders of Cellular Agriculture Canada. He knows the past, present, and future of cell ag like no one. If you like this type of long-form content, please subscribe, like, and comment because every bit helps. Chapters and timestamps in the video as well as below. Let's stay curious, learn about cell ag in this episode of the Learn with Lowell show. How, when you're doing your research for your projects, do you sift through and kind of separate fact from fiction?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Lowell. That is a great question when it comes to figuring out transparency there. Typically, because the role that CellAgri plays in its ecosystem, one of the key communication players, companies and investors generally like to talk to me about what's going on with them in terms of what they can share. Everything that they can share, they do share with me. Obviously, because startups are still developing their technologies as well, it can be a challenge. But for the most part, whatever they can share in terms of what they've officially disclosed, similar with investors and their concerns and thoughts about this ecosystem, they do share that with me, thankfully. And it helps me put together this bigger puzzle and figure out all the different pieces that goes on in that to make this field viable.
Mm-hmm. But so I've talked to a lot of startups on my own, as you know, and even in terms of like the mechanisms that they talk to investors or release to the public when they're being like completely open, there's usually like a line like demarcating like what is actually happening and what they say is happening. So how do you differentiate that line? Either they're saying stuff to you. I imagine it's not like always 100% what's happening. Is my point. So then, how do you handle that?
Yeah, that can be a challenge. Typically, it's very helpful that I'm in touch with a lot of different companies that all say different things that contrast with each other. So if you have two companies saying exact opposite things, or you typically try to find some middle ground there about, all right, company A says they're doing this, but company B says that's totally not possible at all. Company C says, well, if company A did XYZ instead, then some middle ground could be possible. It's about putting all those different pieces together to figure out, okay, company A is really saying they've done that. What could that actually mean in terms of where they really are today? And that's how you piece it together. For example, one of the interesting things I recently saw was how are we going to continue scaling up this field? And some companies say they're more further ahead than others, and some are being more open about that, but others are being a bit more conservative about their timelines and approach. And it's about, all right, how can we compare and contrast these two companies, which to me were at pretty similar stages? If you find the middle ground there, you'll figure out where this field can be this field can be growing and what this technology might frankly actually be.
That makes sense. That honestly, because so it sounds like when you're in it, you're able to kind of like fact check people. You know, it's like our serum is like 100% cheaper to make with our new proprietary process. Like the best you can get is like 20% better. And if it was 100% better, I imagine like they would just be peddling that IP to everyone else versus like keeping it entirely in house. So that's interesting that you can like corroborate it.
I mean, what I will say is many of the companies in the field, on the idea of IP, they're obviously working in-house developing their own technology solutions. Then you see all these newer startups coming in right now with their own specific solution for one part of the IP or one part of the supply chain. And they're getting a lot and they usually report themselves that they're getting a lot of interest from companies for their technology. If their specific niche technology as a supply chain player for one part of the wider IP ecosystem is getting so much traction, what does that say about what's going on in-house in some of these companies? Not saying it's not working, but maybe the more effective ways that some of these niche specialized players are able to address more than others.
That makes sense. I've always wondered, is there going to come a time where there's going to be like a McDonald's type company that just license a bunch of IPs and then builds a bunch of microbreweries across America, for instance, and then you have the sausage, the chicken, all these different players that have been building the individual excellence come together to a point, and then you can franchise it from there. I've been wondering if stuff like that's been happening. I don't know if someone's doing that. I don't know if it is. You should please tell me about it. But I've been wondering it like when is the like there's been like a diversification in terms of what you're talking about where people are specializing, but at the same time there's then going to be like a contraction of IP to like deliver it somewhere. I think.
Can you elaborate on that? Do you mean the idea that you want to start a franchise somewhere and you want to go to all the individual players to put something together,
I mean more like
like along those lines?
well, in the McDonald's analogy, it's like there's one company that's bought up enough for the IP, and then like the McDonald's corporation then franchises it to people below them. That's how they make money, I think, if I understand it. So like, in that case, there's like one conglomerate buying stuff up, either like buying up, acquiring to have like a suite of technology to allow them to have like like a whole store's worth of cell ag or plant based um, food, and then franchising it in the like microbreweries across America. Um, yeah,
That would be a really cool idea. The idea of having an end-to-end solution where you can go to one company or one player saying, I want to start my own cell cultured meat company or my own cell cultured anything, dairy, leather, you name it. I want my end-to-end solution set up over here. Who can I go to? That would be a really cool play for the future. As far as I'm aware of, there's one early stage startup called Animal Alternative Technologies that's looking to explore that concept, but that relies on having essentially a whole supply chain right there where you can just pick, all right, if I want this facility to do meat, all right, let's combine all my different options here from cells, cell culture media, bioreactor, ship that to where you want that facility. Or if it's going to be milk or leather instead, all right, go to different players along my end-to-end solution, pick the best parts and send that to that location. That could be really cool, but I think it might be a bit away still till the field
yeah,
has matured to the point where we can do that. But that would be awesome.
yeah. I think I would imagine it's like a good 5 7 years from now, where before we start seeing a consolidation. That's my guess. I don't know. That's just me like reading your newsletter and just like watching stuff. Um,
I appreciate that. I mean, we have seen a bit of consolidation so far in this relatively early ecosystem. The first acquisition happened end of 2020, actually. That Israeli company formerly called MeatTech 3D, now called Stakeholder Foods, at the time acquired a Belgian cell cultured fat company called Piece of Meat. And that was the first ever acquisition in this ecosystem. And then in 2021, we saw in Asia Pacific, the seafood player Shiok Meats acquire the first red meat player in Singapore called Gaia Foods. And then earlier this year, we saw the first acquisition in the US. Cultured Decadence, a company from the Midwest, actually, not too far away from you, got acquired by Upside Foods, previously Memphis Meats in California. Even though this field is early, it does suggest that there are some early signs of maturation that players can acquire each other. So that is promising.
yeah. For some of the ones I saw, I was curious. There's a difference. So there's acquiring, there's aqua-hiring, and in a couple of cases, it seems like a lot of times people will leave a startup or they'll leave their PhD and they do like a startup their own startup, and they'll do it for about like 2 to like 2.5 years, and then they usually will get bought up by another company and become like a high ranking director or something like that, and so which is slightly different than like building something and having it acquired. I wonder how many of these acquisitions are more just acqui-hires with a little bit of IP sprinkled on.
Really interesting question. As far as I'm aware, all those acquisitions I described, there was some IP behind that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those startups were a lot earlier than others along the timelines, so it could be interesting to explore that. One acquisition I should have mentioned as well was the first acquisition by a meat corporate, actually. Brazilian meat conglomerate, JBS, actually acquired a Spanish startup, relatively early stage one called Biotech Foods, end of last year as well.
Yeah. So things are starting to jump around, and from your investment report,
Slowly.
there every year, your investment report gets like bigger and bigger and bigger. Like at first, it was like the four, if I remember it right, it was like four panels, and there's like maybe like 10 companies in each one, and now it's like so small that when I look at it, you have to like zoom in, which is fun, just to see the development and over the last like 5 years that you've been doing it. Is there Is there a sector in particular that you think is like position itself well in terms of getting money in and actually utilizing it to build something like a foundation that you perceive as being something that could be like a McDonald's or like or like a I think it's not called Memphis Meats, but no, Tyson Chicken, like something that's like a or an Impossible Burger. I think Impossible Burger is like the one that's really done a good job so far. Like it's everywhere, everyone's like actually able to taste it. But for a lot of the other ones, they're like kind of more niche. So I'm curious, like, is there a sector that's building itself well to integrate into the existing supply chain when it comes to food?
Yeah, thanks for thanks for taking a look and your feedback on that investment report. You're right. When we first began tracking the investment landscape at CellAgri, it was a handful of companies, so it's easy to have those big bar graphs. But then, as the field kept on growing and growing and growing, it got a bit smaller to the point now where you had to have separate graphs altogether to separate the cell cultured meat players in the cell agriculture food field, and also what we call the acellular agriculture food players, but that's more commonly known as precision fermentation these days. So now we've now to separate that to highlight how much this ecosystem has expanded. Um, Within that, though, to answer one of the earlier questions, the sector that could be very interesting to look at for that model you just described in terms of you mentioned Tyson chickens. That sounds more like partnerships and different distribution possibilities. That precision fermentation, acellular agriculture side really has shown a way forward for that. Um, Perfect Day is a company in the US doing cell culture dairy protein, specifically whey protein, and they first launched commercially in 2020 after doing a test trial in 2019. And yeah, all through 2022, it's been incredible. They've announced partnerships with so many different brands for ice cream, chocolate, protein powder, even chocolate bars. And the way that continue making partnerships, that's really shown a way to market and a great way for success for companies looking at doing animal protein like that specifically. And because of that, it's not surprising that many of the first big investments in this field have all gone to companies doing things similar to Perfect Day, precision fermentation proteins, or acellular agriculture. To date, Perfect Day is still one of the top funded, if not the top funded company in the cell agriculture food ecosystem still because of that.
Hmm. Is there even now after so many years, is there an element of cellular agriculture? Yeah, and I'll even like throw in like plant based food in that umbrella that you still find magical. You know, like there's like the Arthur C. Clarke quote where it's like anything sufficiently advanced looks like magic, and you get to dig deep on so many different areas. So is there something that's still magical to you, no matter how many times you hear it or learn about it?
Ooh, that's magical. Two things come to mind there personally. First one is the idea of seafood.
Hmm.
We have so many different types of seafood species that we consume around the world. That your company's doing something different there. Get this bit excited, like, oh yeah, people in this part of the world consume that seafood specifically. This is a great idea for a company that's actually based over there. Um, I just find that quite exciting because it's the idea that this field is expanding around the world, and you have scientists and entrepreneurs based in different parts of the world figuring out, all right, how can I apply this technology to make our food system more sustainable where I am to help make our system more sustainable over there. So that usually gets me quite excited. The other thing, the other idea is, I know I'm a big fan of ice cream. I always like the idea of having different ice cream flavors out there and other dairy products.
I agree with the well, I agree with both, but definitely the seafood thing, the one in particular, especially with I mean, like the Alaskan crab fishermen can't even fish this year. Well, crab, this year because of how depleted it's so like they lost like a billion crabs in Alaska or something like that. Like they literally aren't able to do their crab fishing this year, and so you have all those people not making money. You have warehouses, a supply chain that's now been upended. I wonder if you could see. I could imagine a seafood startup just going like partnering with the government who's trying to keep these people afloat and with the people to build the fermentation areas in those giant warehouses. So like 30 to 40% of it's already built in terms of like space. They just need the vats and stuff like that. And I the same time, I wonder if they even have vets up there because I think they have a lot of alcohol consumption. So you could probably like repurpose these things. But I could see, especially with seafood, as like the food web in the ocean is being very fragile, complementing and supplementing these areas that are already part of the supply chain with uh, the same type of mechanisms. But instead of like going out trawling for the crabs, they're in a brewery in a vat, making it that way. How do you see, just like isolated on that, seafood, cell agriculture seafood, um, working with the limitations that are now being put in place in terms of like what the actual ocean can do. Like it's a unique opportunity in and of itself, because I don't think there's any other. There's like the novelty ones where it's like I'm gonna make woolly mammoth steak or something. Like I could see that. That's kind of fun. Or like I'm gonna make blue whale. It's like that's like you can always get someone who's gonna do that. But I think there's a lot of chickens. There's a lot of steak. There's a lot of all these different animals, and so there's reasons to cheaper or whatever. But with seafood, there it does seem like a very unique opportunity because the oceans are not going. They're not doing very well right now. So like how do you see that playing out moving forward, and how yeah, what are your thoughts on that in general?
Yeah, seafood is a great, really good opportunity there. Unlike, cows or chicken, most of the seafood we consume, most of that is not farmed for the most part, and many of these more popular animal species that have been almost overfished to extinction cannot be farmed in aquaculture because we haven't figured out how to do it, or they're just too big. So cell culture seafood is a big opportunity there, and really interesting to see how these players look to work with the conventional seafood industry to make sure that conventional seafood players are not left behind. What you mentioned right now for Alaska, converting those facilities instead of being for crab fishing, how about cell culturing crab meat?
Mm-hmm.
That could be a really interesting way of integrating to existing infrastructure to work with the local industry, make sure that this is still going to be a seafood hub. Yes, perhaps produced differently to complement whatever comes from the ocean. Yeah, comes from the ocean, because if you integrate this technology, it's possible that the ocean environments may be able to recover, and those seafood creatures and the seafood animals that may have been overfished can come back to some sustainable level. I think there are a lot of opportunities there to work with existing governments and infrastructure players for that reason. But it's based on the government reception, then also the local industry reception, that you see this as a way of complementing what you're already doing instead of viewing it as a threat that will replace you down the line. That communication needs to happen and be done correctly.
Yeah, I think it's like in the Midwest we have agriculture co-ops all over the place where people own portions of farms or like portions of the percentage of what comes out of farms. So I can see something similar to that where they own a component of the factory, so it's not just they're building it to eventually replace them. They are literally a part of the future. I can see that going really really well. Um, Also, I think in terms of the startup side, I think the limitation is a lot of the startups now, and you know this more than me, they're very much science led. They don't really have like the business mavericks, thinking like how to integrate everything and produce it in a marketable way. I don't think there's a lot of those type of people.
I'm going to say not yet. So you're spot on there. If you're an early stage company wanting to grow meat or seafood or any of these products directly from cells, you're going to need to have a ton of scientists, also some engineers on board as well to figure out how you can make this at a larger scale. From scientists, if you're playing with cells, you're going to need your stem cell biologists, your molecular biologists figuring out how to make the cells grow. Then you also need your food scientists down this pathway as well, right? To make a food product out of these cells you're growing. And then of course some engineers. But you're right, eventually as these companies keep on growing and move from an R&D startup essentially to more of an actual food business or any other animal product business, you're going to need some more business people on board, from business dev to marketing to sales, all the way to a strong C-suite that understand that ecosystem you're entering right now. I think we'll start to see that a lot more as companies look to commercialize.
Yeah, and I think just like touching back on the crab thing, if it, right now crab fishermen they only really work for like 3 months, and then they're not making money for the rest of the year. And usually, and I would actually need someone to come on the show. If there's someone out there listening to this who knows someone in that field, let invitation open. But I'm pretty sure they work for 3 months, and they usually like contract. I've known some contractors that'll make like 100 grand in 3 months, but then they usually have like government. They're like on Medicaid or something for the rest of the year because they're making no money, and it like taxes like burn a lot of it. And so instead of making like a high amount of money for a short amount of time, and then basically being on government subsistence for the rest of the year to some extent, depending on your budgeting abilities, they could be producing year round, and they could be producing for the whole really anywhere depending on like the shelf life of the material. I think that there's a lot of advantages even in terms of complementing like here like for these 3 months we can do this, or maybe they get 1 month but the next 12 months they could be working in a shop or something like that, which is even not even more nice when you think about the weather up there. Like they literally make shows about how horrible it is in terms of just like the deadliest catch.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. With cell culture technology, you don't have to rely on fishing seasons to do your main work for that crunch time 3 month season, let's say. You could consistently produce the food you need all year round and also work all year round to manufacture or produce that. So definitely could help on that side there. Um, on the idea of seafood, I was just thinking, you know that saying, if you're in a landlocked state or country, don't have the local sushi there because there's no
Yeah,
no body of water over there. With cell culture seafood or cell cultured foods in general, you can take a step back and build your facility in that landlocked state or that country and produce fresh seafood locally, just like that. It's one of the key things you could do with this field. You can have fresh seafood with no ocean nearby.
yeah. I think that's it's one of the unique abilities of so like the distributed nature of it. It makes like we're talking about like seafood in the Midwest and like oh wow that's really neat. You could have something that you could trust. But imagine if there's like a super volcano that goes off and now like or like a war in Ukraine and now like 10% of the grain in the world can't be supplied. Um, this type of technology, you cut it off, they'll just build one a neighborhood over and like sure there's an investment cost, but there's like I mean just looking at Wisconsin because I visited it a lot and there's a lot of microbreweries out here. Like you could easily with add the right incentives and stuff like that or the right partnerships have so many microbreweries just translated in a matter of like days. Kind of like World War II thing where they took a factory that was making screws and made it into tanks in like a factory for a week down in Rockford, Illinois. So you could have stuff like that like translating over. That's one of the things I really like about CellAg. It takes out that huge burden of raising something up. So if there is like a distribute like we've all lived through COVID, like we've heard of these chip supply shortages and stuff like that. I don't think I don't think there's much that CellAg would need to keep producing, even if there was a distribution in terms of global supply. But then, I mean, you'd be able to answer that more than me. Is there a unique element like I think one of the elements of chips, other than just like having like the manufacturing, which is really difficult to do, you also need like rare earth metals. There isn't anything unique in terms of the material for CellAg, right? Like they just have to get like both like the serum material, petri dishes, equipment, but I don't think there's anything like
Mhm.
rare earth metal, like 1% of the on the planet found like really rare.
Right. Um, quite a few cool ideas you just mentioned there, Lowell. We talk about cell agriculture and growing food or any other products directly from cells. When we talk about benefits of it, we usually refer to, environmental sustainability, public health implications, potential public health implications, and animal wealth and improved animal welfare. A fourth benefit for this field that wasn't really talked about before the pandemic was food security and having a reliable source of food being able to be produced locally. Um, Food security wasn't really a topic that was spoken about too much in Europe or North America prior to COVID, but for the first time, many people saw empty grocery store shelves for the first time because of a lack of resiliency in food supply chains to make sure that food got to you. With cell agriculture, like you just mentioned, you can produce that food locally, anywhere and everywhere on Earth, or even in outer space, really. And so that's one of the real reasons why there's a lot of interest for this field from across Asia, whether it's in Singapore, Japan, or across the Middle East, for that ability to improve resiliency in our food supply system and ensure places that rely on heavily on food imports can have some food security without fear of food loss or lack of food availability should there be a crisis in food supply chains that we're seeing right now with the crisis.
Hmm. The
In term
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
in terms of what you mentioned right now about ingredients you would need to produce these food products, you touched on that. To grow cells to become meat, dairy, or any other animal product you'd like, you would need you need the right nutrient formulation for the cells to grow. And based on what different companies are working on, that they're looking to optimize that nutrient broth to be animal free and inexpensive and easily scalable. So different companies right now are exploring using plant ingredients to produce those cells. Other ones are exploring, all right, cells need growth factors, ingredients to help them grow, and those are currently costly. How can we find um, alternatives to those that are more affordable from plants or from algae or just using recombinant proteins from other microorganisms? And so right now we're figuring out the best way to produce that still. But once you figure out the optimal cell culture media formulation, including the growth factors, the hormones, and the other components you need to help the cells grow and make them believe they're still inside the animal, that will be addressed. In terms of, like you mentioned, rare earth metals. I'm not sure if we have an analogy for that just yet for this ecosystem, besides looking at growth factors, making sure we can bring the cost down of that. Because typically when you want to grow cells at the academic lab scale or the pharmaceutical industry, an ingredient they use to help the cells grow is called FBS, fetal bovine serum. That is costly, um, derived from animals and inconsistent from batch to batch. If you want to scale this field, you can't use that. So that's why we're looking at all these alternatives like plants, microorganisms, or recombinant proteins for those key ingredients that fetal bovine serum or currently provides for cells in the pharmaceutical or academic scale.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Thanks for breaking that down. I think you have a very analytical mind. So I'm curious when you look at the different ways to uh, move away from bovine serum. Is there one that you like? Like if you were, I mean, if you were a consumer of seafood and you knew that they were using a specific type, is there one that you favor for whatever reason?
I want to answer this a different way. So it's less so from the consumer perspective, but more so for integrating the existing food supply chains. Some companies are exploring the idea of growing these key growth factors to add to the media formulation in crops. It's called molecular farming, and some of these companies are exploring how can they grow these key animal growth factors in crops, whether it's the tobacco crop or barley or any other crop of interest.
Uh,
Imagine if you have farmers right now who are growing fields of crops for animal feed for the current animal livestock ecosystem. If you could transition those farmers from growing animal feed crops to feed these cells where there's and then you harvest these crops and you extract the growth factors, essentially converting these farmers and livestock players from animal feed players to cell feed players to help integrate them into our current ecosystem. If those technologies are found to produce the most efficient growth factors, and all the companies are saying yes, those are the ones we want to use because they're efficient and they're affordable, then that could be a great narrative of how this field is integrating existing animal livestock supply chains into this one. And I think they'll get a lot of support from livestock players, government players in those particular regions, as well as consumers understanding, all right, farmers aren't being ignored here, they're being integrated into the system.
yeah, I've at the conferences we've been to, I've been surprised by the lack of the people we're talking about being a part of the conversation because like I think there was a comment like, oh, the cattle ranchers of Oklahoma or whatever aren't gonna like what we're building. It's like um in one of them, and in my mind, I grew up on a farm. I've known many people who do that type of work, and if you came in and you said you're gonna have to kill less cows and you're gonna make more money and it's gonna be more stable, they're gonna be interested in that. So instead of having to produce and maintain 1,000 plus like 1,000 thousands and thousands of cows. It could be something more like Wagyu beef, where there's very specialized, kind of what horses are now in relation to when automobiles came up. And they have this other source of money they could go as well. I've always felt like it should be more of a partnership, but for some reason it's more antagonistic. I've only ever heard the antagonism when I speak to farmers. They're like, "Oh, that's really interesting." If it did what I just enumerated, like farmers are actually very much scientists. Like if you gave them a new crop, they'll put it in a fourth of their field. They'll test it out. Next year they'll do a half. The next year they'll do a 2/3. Like they're very much scientists in terms of how they do their business. And so I'm curious and surprised that they to date in terms of the ones that I've seen. I usually look for them. You can kind of tell the people that are doing the type of work. You can just look at their hands. You can tell like how roughed up they are. Um, I mean, is that a shared experience for you? Have you noticed them not really being a part of the conversation?
Oh yeah. In the bigger picture of how this field has grown, they probably should be more farmers and livestock players on the at the table, particularly at the farming level, to highlight how we're making a future food system for everyone and including everyone in that vision. Um, Being antagonistic to conventional players isn't going to help anyone win. We all grow together. You can't just leave someone behind and pretend it's going to work out for you. Um, I think in that way, there's one group in Netherlands actually called Respect Farms. Ara van Alen, she's incredible. She runs that organization. And her main goal is to explore this idea of decentralized bioreactor and cell culture meat production, how to integrate existing cattle players into the future of meat with cell agriculture. It's a conversation that will likely evolve further as we move along, but we definitely need to have those conversations and engage them today. Hi, I'm a player trying to use cells to produce meat in the future. You use animals right now to produce meat. How can we engage and work together to make sure we're integrating existing meat players into the future of food?
Yeah, I think of all the technology that's going on right now, or over the last like 200 years, when something new like this happens, like there's the automobile and the horse analogy, um, I think this is one of the few ones where there shouldn't really be that much disruption. I can imagine like West Virginia being like a coal place, and as people move away from coal, it's like, oh, okay, now that people aren't really gonna make money there anymore. But with this stuff, people, if anything, people have more agency and more control over what they produce and how they contribute to the web, and making it even more local. And there's a lot of studies where it's like if you put $20 like in a farmer's market that gets taxed locally versus going down to a Walmart where the tax goes to like a corporate thing in like New Jersey and they don't get taxed as much. Like more of that tax goes to your local community, which then puts it into schools, police, and education, all those libraries and whatnot. So I think this is one of those scenarios that when as it gets more in and adopted, I think it's actually going to benefit more local communities, more places where like in the country, everyone talks about how like everyone's moving to the cities. We don't really move to the cities anymore with this paradigm. You can
This
have
is
all the
true.
benefits of a city in the country.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So we definitely need to explore more ways to integrate conventional um, farmer players in the livestock industry into this future food space. The idea you mentioned right now, decentralized production, that could be a great way to definitely do that. Initially, we'll likely see initially we might be a wait before we see that because lots of companies right now, what they envision is initially scaling up production to large centralized facilities just to prove that this field can be economically viable at that larger scale. And then moving forward, we can likely explore the idea of decentralized local production down the road, where we can have, like you just mentioned, a local ranch that has cattle as well as a bioreactor there as well, producing cell cultured meat alongside the cattle,
Hmm.
a way of integrating both worlds.
Yeah. I wonder what would be the cost differential if you did a bunch of partnerships versus just had a centralization. Like two startups, one's doing distributed in let's say Iowa, Illinois, and like I don't know Wyoming for some reason, versus like one that's centralized in San Francisco. The cost of the area alone is going to improve the margin significantly. I wonder actually what would be the cost differential in terms of like at the end of the day, investors just want to make sure that the vision and the money is good. And so I imagine distributor would potentially be less money, especially if you can like build it in the Midwest versus on the coast, because the coasts are just so. I mean, for what people pay out on the coast to the Midwest, you could be like a king of a king. Like you'd be the guy making fun of a king. Like that's how much things are cheap out here. Um, I'm curious. Has anyone punched those numbers in? Has anyone done like an analysis and seen like, here's what we. This is how much you can produce from one centralized location that's this size. And if you looked at the production decentralized, how much they would make and what the costs would be.
So on the idea of the costliness of being in the coast, I was recently in California for the Cultured Meat Symposium, and I went to Chipotle while I was there, and I wanted to treat myself. I added guac to my dish, $20, and
Mm,
I was very surprised by that cost point. So, but you're right. Building a large scale facility in a coast area would be quite costly. I imagine as many of these companies look to scale up to get to that large scale facility, they're going to move away from the coast and move into probably near the Midwest, frankly, where we already recognize as the bread basket region, right? So that way, land would be likely less costly, but also in terms of distribution and transportation, you can reach a lot more of the country that way within a 24-hour drive. So we likely see more companies set up away from the coast or away from the big cities when they need that giant facility with a lot of land and they want to cut costs down. In terms of the cost difference between a larger centralized facility or a decentralized small scale, a, a consultancy group last year called CE Delft made a techno-economic analysis exploring how much that could cost. And their conclusion was for a larger scale 10 kiloton cultured meat facility, the cost of that to produce would be $450 million. That's a lot of money.
hmm
There's yet to be any studies done on the cost of a decentralized smaller scale facilities. But if the cost of a larger centralized facility is going to be that big, um, it implies that you need to address some of the major technical challenges in making that viable before you can explore a distributed smaller scale cost point.
Well, if anyone listening is a nerd and looking to get a PhD in something, please do a PhD in this and then send me that thesis. Um,
That
so
would be
when
great to read.
I'll also send it to you as well. You probably do a co-posting on your website. Actually, in terms of your website, we talk about integrating different parties that are non CellAgri, like the farmers, the ranchers, etc. And when it comes to the internet, if I'm trying to learn something about CellAgri, I just go to your website. So, what are your plans for integrating them? Like, do you have? I'm sure you've. I mean, in this conversation, I can tell that you have some passion around this subject. So, for someone who is like such a tentpole for the industry, what are your plans for integrating these different parties into the conversation?
Hey, appreciate that, Lowell. So appreciate that you are a reader and check out the CellAgri website quite a bit. In terms of integrating all these different players, I like CellAgri is the main platform that whether you're a food producer, government official, or any other party that works in the food ecosystem, CellAgri has been one of the portals where many of these players first read about this ecosystem and understand what it is. And they usually reach out to me afterwards explaining, all right, I'm a food player in this part of the world. I'm interested in this technology. How can I help? And then we explore different opportunities like, all right, this where you are, you're specializing in this specific sector that relates to the pharma industry. Have you considered exploring ingredient inputs for the cell culture media formulation? What do you say about that? And for example, through conversations like that, I've been able to meet a lot of different players and help them integrate their current food play or pharma play into this ecosystem. So typically, because it's one of the first websites that people come to, I've been able to meet a lot of different people and try to help them integrate into this field.
Mm. I could also see like blog posts or interviews where you sit down with like a Celag startup and like a rancher and just have a conversation about like how they could help each other. I think that would boom. And I want like in the footnotes, Lowell was this idea, but
You'll be the one moderating that.
yes, I would do it. I even know the farmers, but I've been thinking about doing more interviews with like contrasts, where like a religious person with an atheist, or like a scientist with a person who didn't finish high school, and just like have a conversation about life. But because I think like contrasts are fun, like hot and cold. There's a food scientist that designed a way for you to like in your mouth roughly you feel like one temperature or one sensation or taste versus other tastes, like in terms of temperature. He found a way to make your mouth feel hot and cold at the same time, like using like he was like a bioengineer. Anyways, we'll get sidetracked. Uh, Basically, I look forward to seeing these type of things on your website. In terms of nonprofits, because I know I believe you have your own in terms of the one in Canada, right? Or yeah. So
That's right. I'm part of the co-founding team of a nonprofit in Canada called Cell Agriculture Canada. Like the name suggests, the goal of that nonprofit is to advocate and raise awareness of the cell agriculture field across Canada, because compared to the US, the UK, or most of Europe, cell agriculture is still relatively unknown in Canada. So the goal of that nonprofit is to help raise awareness of the field and let people know there that this field exists and you can become part of this ecosystem.
well, if anyone is interested in what we're talking about and is in the Midwest, we could form our own. We'll call it the Heartland. So like it's about integrating all the players. But the one thing I've thought about, because especially when we're talking about New Harvest, they've generated a lot of IP, but they generally have just made it open. But I've really thought like a different model would be that we have these a couple of nonprofits that develop the some of the like a lot of startups are just reinventing the wheel, like the Serum, the processes and stuff like that, where they develop some of the standards for the industry. And instead of just completely making it open source, but like a percentage getting kicked back to them, but like what universities and like Yale does this, Harvard does this, and so using that type of model, you could be generating so much good for the industry, but also like tapping a little bit back into your organization so you can continue to do that feedback loop of good. And I noticed with New Harvest, they're always having like funding issues. So, so I feel like they should do this. But what do you think about that method? Is there a reason why? I mean, you're the one of the big wigs at a nonprofit. Is there a reason why like nonprofits don't do that in this space? Don't like have a little bit like Yale and Harvard and all these other big players will do to people, where they develop the IP, push it out there, just get a percentage, and then keep supporting people.
I'm not sure of any nonprofits that actually have work in that model around IP. That's quite interesting. But I will say New Harvest as a nonprofit, they're the ones who built this whole ecosystem. They do
Yeah,
incredible work for the cell agriculture field. And the whole idea of trying to build a base for a brand new novel ecosystem in terms of a research base, New Harvest were the ones who built that. So
yeah.
by making all the IP, so a step back, New Harvest funds PhD researchers and helps them establish and answer some of the key questions people have about this ecosystem, from cell culture media to cell line to scaffolding. New Harvest research fellows have done an incredible job in establishing all that um, key research, and they do a great job making all of those research papers open access.
Hmm.
And because of that research, they've established a base of which every other company has built upon. So I think that's the role that they've focused on, building this entire ecosystem. And through more research, through more research that becomes open access, like what New Harvest has been supporting this whole time, we can likely get to the point where through open access research, the whole field realizes, all right, hang on, through these openly available papers, this is the best way to build bioreactors, or this is the best cell culture media solution. We don't have to spend all that money in-house trying to do our own R&D to develop our own product. There's an open access resource right there that is the best way to move forward, and that can move this whole field forward as a result of that. I think because this field's been relatively early on, starts to emerge the same time the research ecosystem is being built for this field. Companies have been forced to spend lots of their funding to do R&D in-house to develop their own technologies and IP as a consequence, to figure out how to make this field scale and viable. But through work of nonprofits like New Harvest and even like Good Food Institute supporting public research and making it open access for this field, so that you get to the point where academia may find the optimal solutions for this field to move forward. That and what's that phrase? A rising tide lifts all ships. Lifts all ships. that could happen for this field.
No, I agree. It's been very beneficial the way they've been doing it. I think that it's still right. If anything, it accelerates the raise in the tide because they can more sustainably develop the field. Because right now they have to like every year go hat in hand, depending on like how the certain like deals where they like over several years people donate like quarter million a year, something like that. Um, it's less of a sustainable model. If it's just like all like if anything like the best like one of the arguments I'd say for that model is they're designing themselves to be obsolete after a certain period of time. But if they had a feedback mechanism like what these big universities do, where they just get a small percentage, but still have it open source, and people can read it and do all that stuff as well, like there's layers to it. I think that would accelerate things so they'd have more cash to support more research, to support more fundamental things. So then you just have more experts in it. I think most of the CEO, most of the technical leads for this industry came out of New Harvest programs, and Kate Kruger is one of the big nerds that trained a lot of them. It's like when you if you ever go to like a PhD, like a university's office, you can like some people have like a lineage of them like being teachers, like the like heirs of like Darwin or something, because like Darwin taught someone, and then that person taught someone, and then that's there. So it's fun to see like most people like one generation removed from Kate and New Harvest. I imagine it would just accelerate it. I don't think it would decrease it unless you see something I don't. Like, why would it decrease the rising of the tide if you had a Harvard type IP structure but still open source? You'd have the best of both worlds. Like it's like 99% open source. It's
Yeah.
still qualitatively should be qualitatively cheaper.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure if one can develop IP that one licenses as well as being open source. I can't say I've looked too much into that, but in
Mm,
my mind, those two things can be contrasting because one implies you're not being open with everything to develop the IP.
yeah. Well, I know with tech you can make some open source and still um, make money from it. At the same time, if they just make things publicly accessible, and then if you want to use it, you just pay a percentage on it, I think that'd be fine. But I'm sure there's a lawyer out there who could set it up better. But I think my point is, I think that'd be a better structure because then you can more sustainably grow things. If you do that with, you should test that out. Like if you can make Canada's bigger than New Harvest, then we'll know it works. Um, it'd be funny as well if the Canadians finally beat the Americans at something other than war. Canada beat us once, technically.
Wow.
Yeah, not really. It was more the British, but I'll give you guys credit. You don't have much else to look forward to nowadays. There's a lot of negative stuff
The
going on
Canadians
there.
were there.
Yeah, you got the mousses and the maple syrup. Is there? I mean, I said we are talking about people breaking apart in terms of like focusing on different things. Do you see regions specifying in terms of the supply chain? Like we talked about this about Middle East, where it's like, oh, this place could be the serum, this place could be one aspect of whatever. But do you see geographically areas specializing, or is it even in terms of like the supply chain? It's still already decentralized. Like there's no there. It's already kind of like taken on the model we've been talking about throughout this conversation and the benefits of it, where everyone is in the Middle East building the whole thing. Everyone in Europe is building the whole thing. America's building the whole thing. But yeah, how are you seeing the actual implementation of these things in terms of specialization uh, throughout the world?
Yeah, so what we've been seeing at CellAgri is the idea that companies all around the world or players around the world generally have been trying to build everything themselves.
Hmm.
Um, the whole full stack, so to speak, of all the components to make the meat as well. Having said that, in the last few years, we've been seeing a lot more companies pop up all around the world, focusing on one specific part of that supply chain, of that stack to produce cell cultured food products. Um, it's hard because this field relies so much on scientific research and R&D. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily resilient. It does not necessarily rely on one area in particular to specialize in media or scaffolding, for example. It just relies on the scientists and engineers wherever you are. However, having said that, it is possible that scientists and startups based in certain parts of the world may have access to local plants or crops that may be ideal or best suited to become a source for the cell culture media formulation, for example. That's always possible. In terms of geographic breakdowns, I'm currently in the UK, and what's been quite interesting over here is we've seen quite a few startups come out of universities here as spin-outs that are all specializing in one certain part of the supply chain, which is quite interesting to see. Um, compared to the US, when many of the initial startups were all trying to be full stack players. Here in the UK, many of the initial startups all try to be specialized in one part of the ecosystem, whether that's bioreactor design, cell culture media formulation, or some other specific part of building this field up. It's quite interesting. It just probably a response to the academic and start spin out culture here to focus on one part of the ecosystem and focus on that and the academic expertise. But generally speaking, there is no specific geographic breakdown in terms of where certain supply chain players are based.
Yeah, I think
I will add
one.
though,
Oh, my
I
bad.
will add though, if you're a company looking for a supply chain partner, where might you want to who where might want to find that player? If you're between, all right, I want to partner with startup A or B for component X, but startup B is based in a country that has regulatory approval and company A is not, what is it possible you might be more likely to partner with company B that's based in the country that has regulatory approval, and that's where you want to launch your first product? It could some geographic influence may play a role there, but beyond that, geography at this point hasn't shown to have any impact on that.
Hmm. I could see the molecular farming that you were referencing earlier being one of the ways that things are limited. If there's just like a scope that things like wheat can be grown in or like cocoa beans can be grown in, that would be potentially the limiting factor of some of these plants. Like if you can do it with corn, then I mean you're pretty much good at everywhere. But if there is like like a Middle Eastern weed that's like really good, like weed, not like the smoking of weed, and that's like really good for this type of stuff. I could see that being a limiting factor, like literally the geographical climate outside of like then again if you don't need that much of it and you can make it in high quality. I see that process similar to how insulin is made. Originally we I believe had to like mulch dog livers or something to make enough insulin, and then now we make it with like yeast, make a ton of insulin through yeast. And so it'd be interesting if we need these types of different building blocks to use a similar like bacteria, but in this case, it plants like a more macro level organism to, which is doing a lot of stuff there. I haven't honestly. This is the first time I've heard about this. I'm actually really interested in it. I'm gonna Google a lot of it after this because
Yeah, that's
it's a
I
it's a
mean
very interesting
when
thing.
you look
Yeah.
at yeah, when you look at crops to like molecular farming to grow certain inputs for this field, you're absolutely right. Geography can dictate where those plants grow if you want to have a local source of that ingredient as opposed to shipping it in. So that could play a role. Um, beyond that, beyond that, it's hard. We, we haven't seen the real geography plays just yet. Um, who knows? Maybe vertical farming or greenhouse technology can address that geography challenge for growing certain crops.
Mhm. Well, one of the things that's like one of the other benefits, like everyone's talking about inflation and stuff right now, like oh the food price is going up and whatnot. There's less hands touching cell ag because there's I mean you don't have to raise the animal, you don't have to distribute that like especially if you use a decentralized model. Like I mean like the Midwest is interesting. Like Tennessee is like one of the largest Amazon fulfillment centers, even though it's like in the heartland. It's like you would think like oh you want to be on the coast to be at New York. It's like nope you want to be in the West. But I mean like the Chicago was like the butcher capital of the world because ever all the ranchers came into Chicago. It could have been St. Louis, haha St. Louis you didn't want to do trains. They all came to Chicago and they got shipped out east. But I think there's less hands touching it. So then, in, like just in terms of manual labor, if anything fluctuates in terms of the cost of living, your pay, food, any of those things, like it wouldn't really like the things that affect the cost of food. I don't think would affect cell ag as much as it does normal agriculture, like significantly. Where like you could see normal agriculture fluctuating by the price, maybe like 10% or whatever. I mean, there's some food prices that have like tripled in cost. Cell ag, as it's once it's been brought down to like a level that it's cost effective, it seems like it'd be relatively stable.
Yep, I'd agree with that. Similar to the idea of controlled environment agriculture, vertical farming, once that can scale up and the inputs are reliable, the cost of that will not change from year to year, despite whatever the weather might be around it. Similar for cell cultured food products for meat or dairy or any of those components. If because it'll be made in controlled environments, it would not be susceptible to impact of the environment around them, whether that's, for example, any zoonotic disease that causes a whole farm to cull their whole species, their whole cattle, for example. Um, this field would not be susceptible to that. The only possibility for that could be if any of those ingredients inputs for the cells to grow, if the price of that varies heavily, that could impact cost of this field from year to year. But other than that, you're right. This field will not be susceptible to the same supply chain challenges if done either all vertically integrated for a company or having resilient supply chain to make sure that that would not be a problem.
Hmm. An additional benefit is like one of the things that bothers me about meat, for instance, is like the theoretical possibility of getting mad cow, the Klein-Jacobs prion disease that'll just like wipe you out in 6 months. I They already have tests where they could tell like if there is that prion in a blood sample or a serum sample. It's like small scope, but I mean we're talking about small scope right now as well. So I think there'd be less like things that affecting the animal in these horrible ways going on to humans as well. So it'd be safer for humans just in terms of disease. And if like something were to happen to like one like bioreactor, like I mean it's already self-contained, like it's already like quarantined. Be able to just like quality assure that. That's what I think is really interesting about this. I think it just like we've been talking about, it raises all the tides, which is really exciting. If you were to, as you look out in the future, what do you like? We like opened a window in 4 years. What do you think is going to be here in terms of like actual production instead of just like R&D? I know one thing we talked about is how like many people are like bottle label cell agriculture startups businesses, but they end up producing more of a plant based thing. So do you see that trend reversing? Do you see that trend continuing? Like what does the window of the cell agriculture field look like?
Yeah, so 4 years from now, that'll be exciting. So far, only Singapore has given regulatory approval for the sale of cell cultured meat. Hopefully, within in that 4 year window, we see a lot more countries getting approval for that. Many eyes are looking at the US right now for regulatory approval. Personally, I think the next place to give regulatory approval will be in Asia still, and likely the next few countries, whether that's Japan, South Korea, or even one of the countries in the Gulf in the Middle East, will be one of the next few spots, and then eventually it'll come to regulatory approval will come in the US and one day in the distant future, Europe as well.
Hmm.
But that's something I imagine we'll see a lot more of in the next 4 years, where government's getting on board, realizing, all right, this field's worked well. It's come to market in Singapore. How can we learn from that and apply that to where we are? That's one thing I imagine. Product launches will be something we see as well to that end. A few companies right in the last few months have announced plans to set up a partnership with facilities in Singapore to launch there by 2023 or 2024. So like we see a few more product launches. To touch on the idea you mentioned about blended products, many companies when they look to come to market right now are looking to blend their cell cultured meat or fat cells with plant protein to help address the cost challenges of 100% cell cultured meat product because of how expensive it is today without a scaled up supply chain and without addressing some of those technical challenges entirely just yet. So for at least the first generation or two of products, there most definitely or very likely be blended or hybrid with plant protein to address those cost challenges, as well as some of the initial taste and texture challenges a new food product like this may have. But moving forward, as companies address those taste and texture and scale up challenges, we might get closer to a 100% cell-based product by a 4 year window from now. Perhaps not entirely, but much closer.
Hmm.
And the next thing I say is going to be quite important for this field in the next 4 years is partnerships. Partnerships with traditional food players who can help these companies that are essentially producing just an ingredient for an end food product get to the market. I mentioned Perfect Day earlier. They've been really good at making partnerships with a range of ice cream and other range of food players that use dairy proteins in their ingredient supply chain. And without those partnerships, it'll be a challenge to come to market. So we'd like to see a lot more of those partnerships to not just help companies scale up production, but also on the downstream distribution side and product um, development to make sure that these cell cultured ingredients, cell cultured foods become part of our food supply chain and part of our future food system.
Hmm. It sounds like a very exciting future. One
Oh
element
yeah,
I
it
was
really
thinking of
is.
as yeah, it's a great time to be alive. I think sometimes people are like, oh, there's so many bad things going on. It's like I don't know, pick your thing and then focus on it. Um, the another thing benefit to this technology, and I don't know, I haven't thought about that before this moment, but like you have like guaranteed like no slaves or any indentured type people making this stuff. You know, like right now there are a lot of places like chocolate, for instance, like a lot of them are like literally being made in like with like slave labor, where most of this stuff is like highly technical. So it'll be a good job for people. It'll be a good opportunity, um, and we'll have something like that's end to end, just great for people. Like I imagine the people in like Africa. I think there's like 30 million slaves in the world right now, which is like from a number standpoint the highest it's ever been. But as a statistic, it's the smallest it's ever been. So, like in terms of like how many slaves exist in in the world, I think that's a really interesting thing as well. I know like we talked the ethical benefits to the animals, but I think the ethical benefits or the moral benefits to humans is also something really interesting when we can really excise that tumor of slavery from and just make it an archaic piece of our past, something to learn from, but no longer influence our future. I think that'd be really powerful because I don't think when it comes to the research I've done on slave labor as it relates to like what it does to the world, it's mostly in agriculture. We're like it's mostly just working fields. Um, so this type of technology really could do a lot. Um, I don't know what they would do instead, but they could have jobs. Like they're just like, oh, this doesn't work anymore. We have to give them jobs or something. I don't know how that transition would
Yeah,
work.
yeah, I agree with that. When you look at how using producing food directly from cells, it involves a lot less labor. To run these facilities, you'll require less people than a conventional animal food production. And while that can lead to some challenges, it results in a more controlled environment, and you can prevent these human right atrocities.
Sweet. So I have some personal questions, and then we'll be
Oh,
like
nice.
we should be. They are just letting you know. It's cool if you need to take a pause. But so the first one is, uh, what does happiness mean to you? So I'll preface this and give you a second to think about it. I thought happiness was like a uniform thing in terms of like what people think happiness is, but I've been asking people this, and there's actually quite variability in terms of what you would think that what you think happiness is what it's not the same as everyone else's. It's really interesting. So what when you think of happiness, what is it to you? How do you experience it?
Happiness to me. I like that question. I'll think about that for a second. My first thought that comes to mind is happiness is community.
Mm,
The idea of working with a group, with a collective community towards something. Community could be friends, family to help celebrate um, a loved one's accomplishment or togetherness that way. Community is my answer for that.
yeah, it's interesting. It's a good answer. Is there something you're struggling with right now? Like personal, professional? Is there something that you're working through? Either like a problem you're having, like you're like angry all the time, or you don't have enough love in your life. I don't know. You got something that you're working through right now?
Yeah, someone asked me this question the other day about challenges with running CellAgri, and I thought about that, and one of the main challenges I'm having is actually a good problem for the field entirely. When I began CellAgri, back at the end of 2017 and through those early days, it was easy to keep on top of everything going on in this field. It was a handful of companies, and everything was right there to see. Now this field has exploded across the world. You have scientists and entrepreneurs and companies all over doing some incredible work in this field. At times, it can feel like a challenge and overwhelming trying to keep up with everything. But in the bigger picture, this is a good thing for the field.
Hmm. Well, you could like have your own type of like I don't know what New Harvest does, but like the PhD researchers. There's other people that want to learn how to do what you do. You could take people from college or take people with interest and help them be introduced into it. I mean, there's thousands of people across the Midwest that would love to probably help with that. I don't know. You can make like an apprenticeship program or like an internship program or um, an editing program. Like there's like so many people that actually would like to legitly do what you do, and versus like the TikTok version where like everyone's dancing, which is kind of what how things are now. You could do something
Yeah,
like that, and
good
then make it
idea
easier on
there.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
The Winston Churchill, he wrote many books and did a lot of things. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I read about him, and it's all of his writing. He had a team of like 20 people who would research things and just consolidate it for him. And he would take that consolidation and he would translate it out. And there was like a lot of the writing they'd help with too. So you're like a lone ranger right now. But if you built a community around yourself, just in terms of your business or in terms of how you work, I think it would make it easier for you to do your job, even in terms of like information aggregating, idea generating, distribution, all these other things. Um, so you could be like Winston Churchill. I don't know if you're a fan of the guy. You're in the UK, so I mean, I don't know, mixed blessing.
This is true. I am in the UK, and I like that idea having a team of fact checkers like that. Do you say you had a team of 50 people?
He had a lot. I mean, it's a lot. It's 20. I think he had like 20 permanent, no matter what
Oh
time of
wow,
the year, just working on stuff for him. He had a
not
lot.
bad. That would be fun.
Yeah. I will add a caveat to anyone out there that's like, oh, I have to do everything by myself. He was born like he was like first name basis with the Kings. Like he was born nobility. He was like a rich guy. So it's like it's fine if like he was like some people are born in like first base, second base, third base, whatever. He was born like looping the he was just like victory lapping repeatedly. So like it's a little easier for him to do stuff. So it's fine if it's like harder for everyone else. Um, so no books, no resources. What's the future of CellAgri going to be?
Ooh. So the goal of CellAgri has been to become one of the main news and insights platform that people can go to learn anything, everything they want to about cell agriculture. As this field continues to evolve and grow, there's going to be a lot more information that people will need to know about this field. What are the latest insights about commercialization for this field? Where can I go find these products in the future? So CellAgri plans to grow this field. That's how I see this field, the field growing, and how I see CellAgri growing alongside it to keep up with it.
And then I will like sometimes I ask this question because there's so many things we could talk about. But is there anything that we could have talked about that we didn't talk about in relation to this field that you feel like people need to know, or just in fun? We can have fun talking about it.
Yeah. Generally, when I talk about this field, it's very easy to get excited about this field and try. Uh, it's very easy to get excited about this field because we're all passionate about making a sustainable food system. But for those who are not inside this ecosystem, it can be communication is going to be key because it can be hard to understand what this field is really all about. When it comes to any novel technology, communication is key, and with food, it matters so much more. So it's not just it's not just about explaining how this field works, how we can take a few cells and make food out of it, but explaining the why behind it. Why are scientists and businesses wanting to make meat out of cells when we have a cow right there? Like that context is going to be everything for this field moving forward. And communication is going to be one of the biggest ways to address that, whether you're talking to consumers, parents, farmers, governments. Communication is going to be a really key play in that.
Mm. I think if my suggestion would be like go to the example that makes your point. I think the seafood, the Alaskan crab fishermen, I mean the people that keep having oil spills, etc., that they're making the point why it's so valid, why it's so important. And then if
Exactly.
you look at it as a microcosm in terms of like how you can implement it, I think it makes it really easy. One of the negatives. It's like it depends on what you're doing. But one of the interesting things about the United States is like we have a federated system, so states can do stuff without the federal government really having a say so in it. Then there's some things that the federal government is going to say no matter what you do. But so you could go to Alaska. Like Alaska has so much oil money coming in that they literally give a dividend to their people, for instance. So they basically have like a surplus that they give back to the people. So you could have Alaska being pretty active in pioneering government cooperation, and they have a lot of reason to want to do it as well, considering like a huge section of their economy is now out of a job. Um, that'd be my suggestion. I think go with like the win, and it's evocative and makes the point. Cows, you'll always have people like, well, there's already so many cows, so there's always beef on the aisle or whatever. And then I think the point's just like the cows become Wagyu beef or something. But that's how I would suggest it. Thank you for joining us today with the Learn with Lowell show. Check us out at learnwithlowell.com. Anywhere podcasts can be found, subscribe. Tell me what you thought of this episode. Check us out on YouTube in particular. It's a new thing I'm doing. Timestamps and links are in the show notes. Thank you for coming, and I hope every one of you found something today that you're curious about to learn more about, and you'll go out and be curious and learn something new. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.